Welcome to Life Stories. What would you do if you overheard a chilling murder plot, one that could change your life forever? Emma Carter was just a hotel maid, invisible to the wealthy guests she served. But one fateful day, she stumbled upon a deadly secret that led her into a world of betrayal, power, and long-buried truths about her own past. Could she escape the danger, seek justice, and reclaim the life she never knew was hers? Stay with us as we dive into today's incredible story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to never miss a new life story. The smell of bleach clung to my hands. No matter how many times I washed them, it was embedded in my skin. A quiet reminder of the life I led. The one that kept me invisible. People like William Harrington never noticed people like me, maids, housekeepers, the silent workers who swept through their world like ghosts, tidying up their chaos without leaving a trace of our own existence. For 2 years, I had worked at the Harrington Grand Hotel in Chicago, polishing marble floors that my own shoes were never meant to walk on, smoothing silk sheets in penthouse suites that cost more per night than my monthly rent. I knew the rhythm of this place well, the scent of wealth, the hush of luxury, the carefully concealed sins that lurked behind locked doors. That morning had started just like any other. I stepped into the grand suite of William Harrington, the billionaire whose name was whispered with equal parts admiration and envy. He was a man of power, the kind who never stayed in one place for long. His presence was like a passing storm, swift, intense, and always surrounded by an entourage of people whose only job was to orbit around him. I had seen him from afar but never up close. Never long enough for him to actually see me. I moved quickly, working through my routine, dusting, vacuuming, wiping surfaces with the efficiency of someone who knew the value of time. The suite was silent except for the distant hum of the city outside, the traffic far below moving like tiny specks of light on the streets. And then I heard it. A voice, sharp, hushed, but unmistakable. I froze, rags still clutched in my trembling fingers. Conversations between guests were not uncommon, but something about this one felt wrong. I turned toward the sound, the adjoining door slightly ajar. I knew I shouldn't listen. I should turn away, continue cleaning, pretend I had heard nothing. But I couldn't. I edged closer, holding my breath as the voices became clearer. The first voice was a woman's, rich and familiar. Olivia Harrington, William's wife. I had seen her before, gliding through the hotel lobby in designer dresses. Her beauty as carefully cultivated as the diamond rings she wore on every finger. And then, I heard the words that turned my blood to ice. "He'll never see it coming," Olivia murmured, her voice laced with quiet malice. A second voice, a man's, responded, low and controlled. "We'll make sure this trip is the last one he ever takes." My stomach lurched. This wasn't some petty argument between lovers. This was a plan to kill William. A wave of nausea hit me, my body screaming at me to leave, to pretend I had never heard a thing. But my feet wouldn't move. My heart pounded so hard I thought they might hear it through the walls. Ryan. She had called him Ryan. But Olivia was married to William. This wasn't just a murder plot. It was betrayal at its deepest core. Panic clawed at my throat as I backed away from the door, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. What was I supposed to do? Call the police? Tell someone? But who would believe me? I was just the maid, a nobody in their world of privilege and power. Even if I did tell someone, what if Olivia found out? She had no problem planning her husband's murder. What would she do to me if she knew I had overheard? I forced myself to finish cleaning, though my hands shook as I dusted the nightstand, my mind racing in 1,000 different directions. Maybe William wasn't a good man. Most of the wealthy people I worked for weren't. But did that mean he deserved to die? By the time I left the suite, I had made my decision. I couldn't let this happen. That evening, I sat in the dimly lit employee lounge, staring at a cup of cheap coffee that had long since gone cold. My hands still trembled slightly as I replayed the conversation in my mind. What if Olivia had seen me? What if Ryan had noticed someone had been in the room? The weight of my knowledge pressed down on me, heavier than anything I had ever carried before. I had to be smart. If I went to William directly, he might not believe me. Worse, Olivia might find out I was involved. But if I did nothing, I would have to live with the guilt of knowing I could have stopped it. The next morning, William arrived at the hotel lobby. As imposing as ever, surrounded by his usual entourage. I spotted him from across the room. My pulse quickening. This was my one chance. I stepped forward before I could lose my nerve. "Mr. Harrington," I called, my voice steadier than I felt. He stopped, turning toward me with a raised brow. His gaze flickering to my name tag. "Yes?" I swallowed hard. "I need to tell you something. About your trip. You shouldn't go. Something's not right." His expression remained unreadable, a flicker of curiosity flashing in his dark eyes. "And why should I trust you?" My stomach clenched. I had no proof, no way to make him believe me. But I had done what I could. I had warned him. That was all I could do. The next morning, as I stepped out of my tiny apartment in a quiet Chicago neighborhood, I froze. Parked right outside was a sleek black luxury car. The kind that didn't belong on streets lined with cracked sidewalks and flickering streetlights. Its polished surface gleamed under the early morning sun, standing in stark contrast to the modest houses around it. My stomach twisted. Who would drive a car like that here? And more importantly, who were they waiting for? I hesitated, considering turning back inside, but then the driver stepped out, dressed in a sharp black suit. He adjusted his tie before locking eyes with me. "Miss Carter?" he asked. His voice calm and measured. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "Yes?" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. "This is for you." My hands shook as I took it. The paper thick and expensive. My name was written in elegant script across the front. Who sent this?" I finally managed to ask. The driver smiled faintly, tipping his hat. "Mr. Harrington. He wanted to make sure you got it." "William." Relief washed over me, but confusion quickly followed. What was this? Had he actually listened to me? I barely noticed the driver returning to the car and pulling away as I turned the envelope over in my hands. My heart pounded as I slid my finger under the seal, carefully pulling out its contents. Inside was a short note, written in the same neat handwriting. "Thank you for your concern. I've decided to cancel the trip." I exhaled a shaky breath, but my fingers trembled as I pulled out the second item in the envelope, a key. It was small, plain, attached to a silver keychain with an engraving, "Harrington Plaza." My brow furrowed. Harrington Plaza was one of the most exclusive residential buildings in downtown Chicago. A place where rent was more than I made in a year. Why was he sending me this? A moment later, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from an unknown number flashed across the screen. "Your new place is ready. Welcome to a fresh start." I stared at the message, my mind struggling to keep up. A fresh start? I had expected nothing. Maybe a quiet thank you. Maybe silence. But this was too much. And yet, something about it felt final. Like a decision had already been made. And this was just the beginning. Meanwhile, as I stood frozen outside my apartment, William Harrington sat in his office, staring at the files spread out before him. Canceling his trip had saved his life. Of that, he had no doubt. But the more he dug, the more he realized his wife had been planning this for a long time. And she wasn't working alone. Something bigger was at play. And if Emma Carter hadn't warned him, he might have never lived long enough to see it. I stood in the center of my new apartment, still unable to believe it was mine. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the Chicago skyline. The kind of view I had only seen in magazines. The furniture was modern, sleek, expensive. It smelled new, untouched, like no one had ever lived here before. And yet, I felt like an outsider. This wasn't my world. I had spent my life scrubbing floors, folding sheets, and living paycheck to paycheck. I wasn't supposed to be here, in a place designed for the wealthy and powerful. And then, there was him, William Harrington. Why had he done this? What did he expect in return? Before I could get lost in those thoughts, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an unknown number. Detective Mark Reynolds. I hesitated before answering. "Hello? Miss Carter. We need to talk. It's urgent." His voice sent a chill through me. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from him in a quiet cafe, my fingers gripping the warm coffee cup in front of me. The detective studied me for a moment before speaking. I assume you know that Olivia Harrington is under investigation, he said. I nodded. I figured as much. His gaze hardened. But what you don't know, Emma, is that this goes deeper than just a murder plot. I frowned. What do you mean? Reynolds leaned in slightly. Your father, Thomas Carter, his death wasn't an accident. I felt my entire body go numb. What? The detective sighed, pulling out a worn folder and placing it in front of me. Thomas Carter was framed years ago for embezzlement. He worked for one of Olivia's father's companies. He found something big. He was going to expose them. But before he could, they made sure he didn't get the chance. I shook my head. No, that's not possible. My dad died in a car accident. Reynolds exhaled, his face unreadable. That accident was staged. His brakes were tampered with. My breath hitched. Why didn't anyone tell me? They covered it up, he said simply. And after his death, they erased every trace of the truth. Your family was left with nothing. You grew up thinking it was just a tragedy. But in reality, it was a cover-up. My hands shook as I flipped through the documents. Old reports and hidden records that painted a picture of a world I never knew existed. Emma, Reynolds continued, his voice softer now. Your father's name was destroyed so they could protect themselves. But the truth is, you're the rightful heir to everything he lost. And now that you know, Olivia will do whatever it takes to silence you. I clenched my fists, my heart pounding in my chest. For years, I had believed I was nothing. But now, I knew the truth, and I would not be silenced. I walked back to my apartment in a daze, my mind spinning with the weight of everything Detective Reynolds had told me. My father hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered, silenced, just like William almost had been. I felt sick. For years, I had been cleaning the rooms of the wealthy, thinking I was invisible, a nobody, but all along, I had been standing in the shadows of the people who destroyed my father's life. And Olivia, she wasn't just some jealous wife trying to kill her husband. She was something much worse. I needed answers. That evening, I called William. My hands trembled as I held the phone to my ear. Waiting, Emma? His voice was sharper than I expected. What's wrong? We need to talk, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. In person. A pause. Then, come to my office. Now. 15 minutes later, I stepped into the towering Harrington headquarters. Everything smelled of polished wood and wealth. The receptionist didn't even glance at me as I made my way to the top floor, where William was waiting. As soon as I entered his office, he closed the door behind me. What's going on? I turned to face him, meeting his gaze. Did you know? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. About my father? Something flickered in his eyes. Guilt? I suspected, he admitted, but I didn't have proof. Until now. My fists clenched. And you didn't think to tell me? Emma, listen to me. He took a step closer, his voice low and controlled. I wasn't sure, but after you warned me about Olivia, I started digging. And what I found, it's bigger than I ever imagined. I swallowed hard. How much bigger? William hesitated before speaking. Olivia's family has been running financial scams for years. Your father wasn't the first to uncover something dangerous. And when he tried to do the right thing, they made sure he disappeared. My stomach twisted. And you think Olivia was involved? He nodded. I know she was. And I know where she keeps her secrets. I felt a flicker of hope. Where? There's an estate upstate, he said. A place her family barely uses anymore. But Olivia still keeps things there. Records, evidence, everything we need to bring her down. I took a shaky breath. Then we have to go there. He studied me. Emma, it's dangerous. I don't care, I said. She took everything from me. I'm not running. A slow nod. Then we do this together. I exhaled. For the first time in my life, I wasn't alone. And together, we were going to end Olivia Harrington. The estate was more imposing than I expected. A sprawling mansion on the outskirts of upstate New York, surrounded by acres of dark, empty land. The air was thick with the weight of history. The kind of place where secrets didn't just hide, they thrived. William and I moved quickly, keeping low as we slipped through the half-open iron gates. It was eerily quiet, the only sounds the distant rustling of trees and the crunch of gravel under our feet. "We need to get in and out," William whispered. Ryan said the safe is in her father's old study on the second floor. Ryan, the man who had helped Olivia plan William's murder. The man who, in a desperate bid to save himself, had flipped and told us exactly where to find the files that could destroy her. We made it inside through a side door, the hinges groaning in protest. Dust coated every surface, the air thick with the scent of neglect. The house was like a museum, frozen in time, waiting for someone to return. William led the way, his movements precise, controlled. We navigated the hallways in silence, reaching the study within minutes. He found a hidden panel easily, his fingers tracing the edge until, click, it slid open, revealing a steel safe. My pulse pounded as he worked on the lock. Every second felt like an eternity. "Hurry," I urged. "I've got it," he muttered, and with a final turn, the safe door swung open. Inside were stacks of documents, flash drives, and folders with names that sent chills through me. Bribery, embezzlement, laundering, and then, the one that mattered most, my father's name. My breath caught. This is it. But before we could grab everything, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Someone was here. We barely had time to react before the study door swung open. Olivia, she stood in the doorway, her eyes cold, calculating, and behind her, Ryan. But he wasn't armed, he wasn't in control. The gun in Olivia's hand told me everything I needed to know. Well, she said, a slow smirk curling her lips. The little maid finally found her way into a world she doesn't belong in. William tensed beside me, his body coiled like a spring. "It's over, Olivia, we have everything we need." Her gaze flicked to the open safe. And for the first time, I saw something crack in her expression, fear. But it was gone just as quickly. "You really think this ends with a few papers?" she scoffed. "You have no idea what you're up against." I lifted my chin. "Neither do you." Before Olivia could react, the sound of sirens cut through the air. She paled. Detective Reynolds had arrived, and this time, she had nowhere to run. The courtroom was silent, thick with tension as the judge read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The words echoed, final and absolute. Olivia Harrington, once the queen of high society, now stood motionless, her designer suit unable to mask the defeat written across her face. The same woman who had ordered her husband's murder, who had played God with my father's life, was now nothing more than a criminal awaiting her sentence. I should have felt victorious. But as I sat there, gripping the edges of my seat, all I felt was exhaustion. It was over. Olivia was going to prison. Ryan had turned state's witness. And the files William and I had recovered had exposed the full scale of corruption that had fueled the Harrington empire for decades. Wealth and power had once shielded Olivia from justice. But not anymore. She turned her head ever so slightly, her icy blue eyes locking onto mine. For a split second, something flickered in them. Hatred? Regret? Fear? I didn't care. She had stolen my father from me, destroyed my childhood, tried to silence me, and yet, here I was, standing in the wreckage of everything she had built, while she was led away in handcuffs. I exhaled, the weight of years lifting off my shoulders. A few days later, I stood in my new apartment, not the luxury one William had given me, but a smaller, quieter place that felt like my own. I had turned in the keys to Harrington Plaza. That wasn't my world, and I didn't want it to be. There was peace in simplicity. A knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. William. He stood there in his usual suit, though he looked different now. Less like a billionaire untouchable by reality, and more like a man who had finally seen the fragility of life. "You're really leaving all of it behind?" he asked. Stepping inside, I nodded. I never belonged in that world. He studied me for a moment before smiling. "Maybe that's why you were the only one strong enough to take it down." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "I didn't do it alone." William glanced around, taking in my new home. It was modest, nothing like the polished perfection of Harrington Plaza, but it was real. Mine. So, what's next for you, Emma? I thought about it for a moment. For the first time in years, I had a future that wasn't tied to surviving day by day. No more scrubbing floors for people who didn't see me. No more being a ghost in someone else's story. I don't know, I admitted, but for once, that doesn't scare me. William smiled. Good. And as I watched him leave, stepping back into his world, I realized, I wasn't just free of Olivia. I was free of all of it. For the first time in my life, I was truly free. The city stretched before me, alive with lights and movement. But for the first time in a long time, I felt still. The storm that had consumed my life, Olivia's betrayal, my father's stolen truth, the lies that had nearly buried me, was over. And yet, standing here on my small balcony, I knew my journey wasn't really ending. It was just beginning. I had spent years feeling invisible, believing my life was meant to be lived in the background. But I wasn't that person anymore. I had fought for my father's name, for justice, for my own voice. I had faced fear and refused to let it control me. And now? Now, I could finally breathe. There were no more secrets waiting in the dark. No more powerful figures looming over me. Just a world full of possibilities. And for once, they were mine to choose from. Maybe I would travel. Maybe I would find work that gave me purpose. Maybe, just maybe, I would find someone who saw me, not as a survivor of tragedy, but simply as Emma Carter. And for the first time, I was okay with not knowing what came next. As I watched the sun dip below the Chicago skyline, I whispered a silent goodbye to the past. This was my life now, and I was ready to live it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible life stories. Stay tuned for the next one.